Hi, this is Sean with Ohmmu Energy, and today we're going to answer some questions that are frequently asked on our support pages. The great thing about the Ohmmu lithium batteries and sodium is that they are designed to be drop-in replacements for your vehicle. And that means that they are compatible with the charging profile. Your vehicle was designed with a certain battery in mind, usually lead acid. And what that means is that there's a maximum and minimum set point voltage that the vehicle uses to manage that battery. Those are reflective of the lead acid chemistry. The great thing about that is that a lithium 12-volt battery from Ohmmu is actually designed with a wider range voltage use than the lead acid. So the lithium can handle a higher voltage than the lead acid. And the sodium can handle an even higher voltage than that, but still reflects higher voltage than lead acid. On the top end, the lead acid charge profile is not going to overcharge these batteries. There's this old concept of memory in certain batteries where if you don't charge it to 100%, they start to lose their capacity. That is not the case in the sodium or the lithium batteries from Ohmmu. They do not have that issue. There is no memory issue with them. You do not need to charge them to 100% ever in their life. Living their whole life only charging to what is a lead acid version of 100%, which may only reflect 90% in the lithium or 85% in the sodium, is not an issue for the batteries. Now on the bottom side, it's going to allow it to discharge to a certain point. And again, it's the same thing. The car is not going to discharge those batteries down to like 6 volts. It actually usually starts to recharge them around 13 in almost every make model of EV, and 13 is the minimum. 13 is a good number for lead. It's also a good number for lithium, and it's also a good number for sodium, because in all three of those cases, it does not represent a fully depleted battery. It represents a battery that still has 10, 20, even maybe 25% of its energy remaining before it starts to recharge. So the charge profile in the vehicle is completely compatible with the batteries, in this case, the Ohmmu lithiums and the Ohmmu sodiums. The other element to that might have some people ask the question is, well, is it different to charge a lead acid battery versus a lithium battery? And the answer is no. They're the exact same process. Charging any battery is the same process that I'm aware of. Maybe there's some special batteries out there that is not the case, but it is always a matter of the external voltage is higher than the battery voltage, current flows in. That's it. You push the voltage higher, and so the current flows in. So the only real difference is what's the voltage of the external source? Is the voltage 14 volts? Is it 13 volts? Is it 15 volts? And then do you cut the current off at a certain point? How much current do you allow would be the other possible factor there. In all of those cases, there is compatibility across all of these chemistries for us. The Ohmmu Energy app is a very helpful tool for connecting to your battery and getting a lot of information off of it. It is not something that's going to connect to your vehicle or through another app. With any of the Ohmmu batteries which are compatible with the Ohmmu Bluetooth app, make sure that you're using the latest Ohmmu Energy app and not the old version of our app, which is called Ohmmu BMS. The Ohmmu Energy app was designed to give you good information and diagnostic tools to go along with your Ohmmu lithium 12-volt battery. So now we'll do a quick walkthrough and show you some of the features of the Ohmmu Energy app. So here is the Ohmmu Energy app. When you load it, it's going to load onto this screen with a list of Bluetooth devices that are nearby. You'll click on the battery, which is going to generally be labeled as something Ohmmu and then the model number, and you will then connect to it. So in this case, we're going to push on the on-off for this battery, and now we're connected to Ohmmu G31, which is group 31, Rev 4. Now once you're connected to that battery, you can go to the dashboard and view some information about the battery. In the upper left, you'll see the voltage. In the upper right, you'll see the current. This battery is not connected to anything right now, and so it has 0 amps. If it were charging, that would be a positive number, and if it were discharging, that would be a negative number. The total power is also here, and that is just an equation of multiplying the voltage times the amperage, and that just gives you a sense of power output, which is in wattage or watts. Then there are 2 toggle switches, the charging and discharging toggles. To use them, you'll need to enter the PIN, which is by default 999000, and then when that's confirmed, it'll let that toggle switch off. And now I'm going to toggle the discharging switch as well, and now that one is toggled off. So now this battery has both discharging and charging are disabled on this particular battery right now, which means that if I connect to it, even with the multimeter, I won't see much voltage at all, and I can't charge it and I can't discharge it. No current's going to flow. And so if I want to turn it back on, of course, you push the same toggles and enter the same PIN, and that will allow you to turn charging and discharging back on. Now below the charging and discharging toggles, you'll see a group of bells, or these are the alerts. And all of those are different conditions that could cause the battery to either cut off charging or cut off discharging based on those conditions. Something like pack over voltage. If the voltage gets too high, it could cut off charging to prevent it from getting even higher. Now the next tab is cells, and cells gives you the voltage of each individual cell, all 4 cells. The battery cells here are just very tightly balanced. You can see the voltage differential of these 4 cells is only 2 millivolts, and so that's really good. On the old version of the app, which I discourage you from using altogether, but on the old version of the app, one of the battery cells would be in red, and that doesn't mean it's a bad battery cell. It only means that that battery cell is the lowest voltage. Now the next tab is the About tab. On the About tab is where there's some good tools for support. One of them, the biggest one, is this one that says Ask for Help. It's the 3rd item down. Ask for Help will just simply collect the data off of the battery and send it to our database. And that allows our support team to look at the information and look at what's going on in your battery and potentially provide you helpful insights or identify if there's a bad battery cell, something like that. So if we ask you to do Ask for Help in the app, that's what we're talking about. You go to the About tab, you hit Ask for Help, the dial will spin until it says success. The one above that says Update Settings. That can also be a useful tool. And what that does is it gives you a list of different update patches that we have prepared, which are just going to change different settings on the battery. And so any of these can be applied, but don't just go in here and start applying things. Allow us to guide you on what to apply. You're not going to necessarily damage your battery, but you could just create more support issues for yourself, or more issues altogether by making changes that are unintentional. So I'm just gonna, as a sample, do the see-do switch setting, the second one down. I tap on that, wait for the dial to finish as it's pulling the information from the database and bringing it into the app. And then when that is done, we'll push confirm and allow it to push the information now into the battery so that it updates those settings accordingly. And then it'll say success. So now back out here, we also have the support email information, so you can use that as a hyperlink to your email program to send us an email. And then there's OTA, which will be used potentially in the future, but currently there's nothing you need to do with that one, which is just, it's for full-on firmware updates, which currently we don't have any issued for most batteries, but that is where you would update them. And then there is an advanced settings tab that is for advanced users and requires a PIN to get in, and that will allow you to do a lot of modifying of different settings. We don't suggest that one unless you are an advanced kind of super user type and you want to make a lot of modifications to the different settings of your battery, in which case, if you want to do that, you're welcome to do so. You do have the power to do so. You could probably just reach out to us through support to make sure that you're doing so in the best, in a really good way, unless you already know everything that you're doing, and that's cool, and you're welcome to do it. All right, that is it. Hopefully that covers everything and gives you a great overview of our app. SOC means state of charge, and it is an estimate that is provided by a computer, or in our case, BMS, that is to give guidance on what the estimated state of charge is, and that's a measurement between 0 and 100%. Either it's completely empty, 0, or completely full, 100%. The voltage is an absolute objective measurement of the voltage of a battery or a cell at that moment in time. The difference between the two is that the SOC is subjective and relies on estimates that may or may not be accurate. The estimate for SOC is especially inaccurate when a battery never gets fully charged and fully discharged. And so you will find that in many applications of our 12-volt batteries, especially when they're installed in vehicles, where the usage is not fully charging and fully discharging, but somewhere in between most of the time, is that the SOC reading tends to be a bit inaccurate. And as a result, we rely heavily in our support on the voltage, and we don't at all rely on the SOC. So a 0% SOC, but a 13.2 volt reading means 13.2 volt reading. We can ignore that the SOC is reading 0% because it is a subjective measurement that in this case is proven inaccurate when we're seeing a 13.2 voltage. That is also the case for the Ancel app, and that is always going to be the case for any 12 volt battery monitoring system. EVs are a little different in that they have very, very large batteries, and they do fully charge and discharge more often. So that is why we rely heavily on the voltage, and we don't rely at all on the SOC when it comes to support. In comparing the amp hour and cold cranking amp values between a lead acid battery, an LFP battery, and a sodium battery, it's important to note how each one is very different than the other, and how those ratings are not necessarily a one-to-one approach. In other words, a 40 amp hour lead acid battery versus a 40 amp hour LFP battery or lithium versus a 40 amp hour sodium battery, it sounds like they all have the same capacity, but the reality is very, very different. The actual capacity is maybe the same in a certain condition within a certain test, which is how you get those amp hour ratings. But in real life applications and in common use, they're very different. The lead acid battery gets its rating based on a full charge and discharge from 100% to 0, which is not a characteristic that those batteries are good at doing. So while it can do it every so often, those batteries are not really made for doing that. And most of the time people will recommend, or system designs would recommend, you're only using about 50% of that. So a lead acid rating should be cut in half immediately in order to, if you're going to compare it to other chemistries where a full cycle is a common use. And so that's the first thing. The other piece is the rating system for lead acid is done on a very gentle 20-hour test, which means that the current is pulled out over the course of 20 hours, which is called a 1/20th C rate, which is the discharge rate is 1/20th of the rated capacity. And so in doing that test, that means it's tested over a long period and it's at a very low discharge current. Lithium, and consequently sodium, because it's kind of the more of the standard approach to modern batteries, is done at a 1/5 C rate, which means that they're pulling energy out in a 5-hour span. So a 40 amp hour lithium battery is doing the test at 8 amps. A 40 amp hour lead acid battery did that same test to get the 40, only running at 2 amps. And so the test in its entire premise is the same, but the test in its application is very different in that the lead acid is kind of not really tested at the same rigor as a lithium or sodium. So again, it gets a little bit of a discount, which is why on that amp hour rating, which is why comparing amp hours in lead to lithium and sodium is a really inaccurate way of looking at things. And this is also why partly in all of our batteries, when we're selling them for particular vehicles, we design them for that vehicle, and doing a comparison between the way the vehicle uses the lead acid battery, how much of the capacity it's actually using, and trying to mimic that in the lithium or in the sodium. And so because of that, it tends to change as we develop new strategies, or as things evolve with those vehicles. Sometimes software updates cause changes, and things change over time. So this variation in how the batteries are tested is a big part of why we don't advertise or promote a certain amp hour rating when we're selling these batteries for a specific vehicle. And that is to eliminate the confusion of seeing a lead acid battery that says it's a 60 amp hour battery, or a spec sheet that says use a 60 amp hour battery, but this is an LFP battery. So that spec sheet that said 60 amp hour is based on a lead acid battery. That lead acid battery, of course, is a lead acid battery saying 60 amp hour. So the LFP equivalent to that is not one-to-one. And one thing that we have decided as a company against doing is using the term lead acid equivalency when it comes to capacity, because that is also a little misleading. I mean, if you understand what it means, it's not misleading, but for a lot of people, they may not understand what it means and how that number is derived. And so it tends to lead to inaccurate conversations where somebody is saying, well, this is a 100 amp hour battery, when in reality that battery may only be a 30 or 40 amp hour lithium battery, but it has a 100 amp hour lead acid equivalency. And so it's kind of a misleading tool that some manufacturers will use, because it can allow them to sort of beef up a number that isn't accurate. So we stay away from the lead acid equivalency terminology altogether, because it's a bit misleading, and we just simply, for the vehicles, we spec them for a particular vehicle. The next part is cold cranking amps. Lead acid has a very good cold cranking amp. Sodium has a very good cold cranking amp. And the reason I'm bringing those two up is that both of them are designed for sodium compared to a typical lead acid. Those are cell to terminal direct connections, meaning inside of the battery cells are connecting to the terminals directly. With LFP, with our lithium, there is something in between, and that is the BMS. And so that BMS acts as a somewhat of a bottleneck or restriction on how much current can flow. And that is why the CCA, the cold cranking amps for the LFP is not as high as the sodium or the lead acid, which is also why if you're looking at a spec sheet for what battery should go in my whatever vehicle, if it's an electric vehicle, a lot of times they'll actually have a CCA rating on those lead acid batteries still, because that's the convention of the market on vehicles. And so they may say 800 CCA. The LFP doesn't have an 800 CCA. I mean, the cells do, but the design, our design does not really qualify as an 800 CCA. But that doesn't mean that battery doesn't work in that car, because the car doesn't use 800 CCA. It's never cranking 800 amps to start an engine, which is what the purpose of the CCA is to start an engine in the cold. In fact, in every EV, the 12 volt battery has a fuse, and usually the fuse kind of on the highest that we've seen are maybe 200 amps, but usually it's even lower. So if you were to actually crank more than 200 amps, which there's nothing that really cranks in an EV. So if you were somehow pulling more than 200 amps, either charging it or discharging it, that would blow the fuse anyways. And that's because there is nothing in the vehicle that should be pulling that much energy out of the 12 volt battery or pushing that much energy into the 12 volt battery. If there is, it's probably a short. It's something that should not be happening. That's where sodium picks up the slack for Ohmmu as far as using it as an engine starter battery, and that our Ohmmu sodium batteries have extremely high CCA ratings, because the sodium chemistry is capable of very, very high discharge rates compared to even lead acid. And so our sodium batteries, a small battery may have a 2000 amp hour or CCA rating, 2000 amp cold cranking amps, just because of the nature of the chemistry being very robust and resilient, and the way that the connection is made internally, where it's the cells directly to the terminals. So that's why on the Ohmmu batteries, you will see a CCA rating on our sodium batteries. You will see an amp hour rating on our deep cycle batteries like the Group 31s. And you won't see either of those ratings on our lithium LFP batteries. So that is our discussion on amp hours and CCA, comparing the different chemistries. In an electric vehicle, there is no alternator. An alternator is the traditional ICE vehicle version of charging a 12 volt battery. So basically the engine starts, and once it is spinning, it spins the alternator, and the alternator spinning creates a voltage, which is used to charge the 12 volt battery, as well as supply the 12 volt voltage to all of the different systems in the vehicle. In an EV, that is in no way part of the process. There is no alternator. And instead, there is an electronic version of that, which is a DC to DC converter. And the DC to DC converter takes the voltage from the high voltage battery pack and converts it down to a regulated 12 volts or 14 volts or some low voltage number. And it uses that value to charge the 12 volt battery. And also it determines when it'll allow the 12 volt battery to discharge by dropping that value. So for example, if the 12 volt battery is at 13.2 volts, the DC to DC converter could decide to charge that battery by increasing the DC to DC output on the low voltage side. So it could push the voltage up to 13.8 volts. If the DC to DC output is 13.8 volts and the battery is at 13.2 volts, energy is going to transfer into the battery, AKA charging. And so that is when the battery would charge. And now it'll only charge up to 13.8 volts as determined by the DC to DC converter in that case where it's set at 13.8 volts. Once that battery hits the 13.8 volts, current is no longer going to travel into the battery or absorb into the battery, and it'll just sit at 13.8 volts. Now, if the vehicle decides it is no longer going to keep that system active and turn that system off to let it rest, maybe the vehicle is off, or maybe the voltage is low on the high voltage pack, or maybe it's just a timed decision by the vehicle, it could drop the DC to DC voltage down to 13.2, or it could turn it off altogether and allow all of the loads to be supported by the 12 volt battery for a while, in which case then the battery would start to discharge. All of that process is managed exclusively by the vehicle, and the 12 volt battery has no way of intervening and telling the vehicle what to do. So sometimes we'll see behavior where we may think it's counterintuitive, like the vehicle is doing something that we don't expect at that time. Like let's say your car has been sitting for 3 days and you come and you check on it and it's showing the 12 volt battery is being charged. That's normal because the battery, although the vehicle is off, so to speak, in EVs, there's a lot of monitoring systems that are always checking in on different systems. And one of those is the 12 volt battery. So it'll check in on the 12 volt battery and see what the voltage is at. And if the voltage really reached some kind of low point, it may turn the DC to DC converter on and recharge the battery, even though the car itself is not on. So that is some of the nuanced differences and important elements to think of when it comes to the 12 volt battery management in an EV. If you just installed an Ohmmu battery in your vehicle and you suddenly get a 12 volt alert message, there's a good chance that the message is being received in somewhat erroneously. And that is an artifact of the lead acid battery that was in there before, and potentially of the way that the vehicle is testing the battery. What we recommend that you do is check the voltage. That's going to be your best indicator of health. And so you will check the voltage using the Ohmmu Energy App, and even more specifically, check the balance of the cells. And that is going to be a really good indicator if there is a bad cell in that battery or not. When you check the voltage, you want to see that the voltage on the 12 volt battery is over 13. And then when you're checking for the balance, what you're looking for is that the delta or the change between cells is below 10 millivolts. Even better, I mean, if it's below 5 millivolts, that's even better. Any tighter is great, but 10 millivolts is kind of a threshold. If the voltage, if the overall voltage is in a good, healthy range and the balance is pretty good, less than 10 millivolts, the chances are pretty good that you actually have a very healthy battery and that the cells are very healthy. Go ahead and reset your vehicle. Depending on the vehicle, that method could be very different, but generally speaking, it involves a deep power down reset, which is ultimately, it's not going to be the same as just a software reset. Like some vehicles, like the Tesla, you hold your thumbs down on the steering wheel buttons to do a software reset. This isn't that. You need to do what's called a deep power down reset, which actually allows all of the different modules in the car, because there's a lot of different computers in these cars. It allows all of them to power down completely and then reboot back together all at the same time under the energy of the 12 volt battery. And that generally speaking, that will clear any of the alerts, because that allows things to reset and resync voltages between all the modules and different alert and monitoring systems. The case where your voltage is below 13, you may need to recharge the battery, and we will talk in another video about how to recharge your 12 volt battery in these vehicles. It is not essential that you remove the battery from the vehicle altogether. However, in order to effectively recharge the 12-volt battery, you should disconnect one of the two terminals so that the energy you are putting into the battery isn't just going into the vehicle itself globally and powering other modules. You just want the energy that you're going to apply to go into the battery, especially if you're not using an especially powerful 12-volt charger. Something like a 5 amp or less charger is really not powerful enough to power everything in the vehicle and charge the battery. So go ahead and disconnect one of those terminals. You can remove the battery altogether, obviously, but you don't have to, is what I'm saying. Then you want to make sure that the charger you're using has a forced charge mode, or a power supply mode might be the other term used. And what that means is that the charger can be put into a mode where it just puts voltage out without checking that it's connected to a battery first. And that's important because of the way that the BMS work in lithium batteries. If the BMS were to see that the voltage got very low and it stops discharging, it will actually open up internally and disconnect the battery from discharging. What that does is it causes the voltage on the terminals to drop. And so now when you connect that charger, it doesn't see that there's a battery connected, and so it won't apply charge. And so it'll just sit and do nothing. That's where you need a forced charge mode or a power supply mode. Or what I really recommend the most as a charger and as a general electrical tool is to just have a variable DC benchtop power supply where you can change the voltage output and the current output and dial in exactly what you want. So if you're going to use one of those, the settings that I would use would be 5 amps or 10 amps, whatever model you have. You can max out the amps. They're not that powerful. But the voltage you'll set to something like 13.8 volts, and then just connect that to the battery and allow it to have a few minutes with the battery so the BMS can recognize that there is external voltage being applied, and reconnect the battery internally and allow it to start charging, which is going to be the flow of energy from the source to the battery. So then the voltage on that battery will start to increase. The other thing you need to be aware of is to make sure that in the app, the charging switch is on. And that is the toggle switch where you put in the PIN number and make sure that that switch is on. You can look in our Ohmmu app overview video to learn how to do that if you're not familiar with that process. All right, that's everything you need to know about charging the battery externally. All right, let's say you're stranded and you're not sure what to do and you think it might be the 12-volt battery. First thing to note is that with any of our batteries, it's fine to jumpstart them. That is not going to be a problem. You can use any of those portable jumpstart tools. However, if the tool that you're using checks the battery voltage first, there's a possibility that it won't engage its jumpstart mode. Make sure you find one that's compatible with lithium. If it says it's compatible with lithium batteries, that's what it means. It means that it understands that there could be a BMS and that the BMS could be preventing something from turning on until the voltage is applied. Jump starting is fine, and you can find one that's compatible with lithium. For the sodium, that's not an issue. You don't need to find one that's compatible with lithium. Generally, my approach to troubleshooting in these cases in general would be, though, is of course, if you have the app, that'd be the best thing to do, is get on the Ohmmu Energy app, connect to your battery, and see what it says. I mean, the voltage in the app shows you what the status of the battery is. If it's sitting at 13 point something volts, that means it's totally fine and charged. The issue is somewhere else. Maybe you would see then in the app, it could be that the discharging switch is off. If the discharging switch is off, there should be an alert one of the alerts should be yellow, indicating that alert is active, and you could look at that and say, okay, this is why it turned off. Maybe it turned off because there was too much current briefly. Then you could turn it back on, and you could figure out if there was a short somewhere, maybe in the wiring, that you could resolve first. Then, I mean, if you're, depending on which model of vehicle, for Rivian, you've got the ride menu that's very helpful to get data out of the car about what's going on. You can look at other videos to see how to get into the ride menu. In the Teslas, you have the service menu that's very easy to access. In that one, again, look at other videos to get into it, but it's very, very easy to access. In the service menu in the Tesla, you can get much, much more clarity on those alert messages that are present. So if you get a bunch of alert messages in the dash, you go into that menu and you can really get more information about those alerts. The most critical part of those is the part that says payload. So you go into the service menu and you look at the active alerts and you look for the section that says payload. The payload will tell you kind of like what information the car saw that prompted this alert to appear. And so that's very helpful diagnostically. Some of the really bad ones that we'll see on Teslas specifically will be the BMS alert, which is any alert on the active group that will say, start with the BMS in capital letters. And that is a BMS in the high voltage battery. Remember that your car has no idea that there's a BMS in the 12 volt battery. So your vehicle is never going to give you a BMS alert that's related to the 12 volt battery. So what that means is that BMS alert is an alert on your high voltage battery system. And that could be a short circuit detection or a reduced isolation resistance, which means somewhere in the wiring or somewhere in one of the modules, the total isolation between the high voltage and the chassis has decayed somewhat, and the resistance isn't as high as it's meant to be. That usually is like, it could be a failed heater module, could be a failed any of your high voltage modules. We've seen them all. Those BMS alerts will prevent the battery from engaging, the high voltage battery from engaging. And if the high voltage battery doesn't engage, that means there is never going to be any support for the 12 volt battery, i.e. it's never going to recharge a 12 volt battery. So the 12 volt battery could be on, you could have your MCU on and you're seeing data and it looks like the car's on, but it won't turn on. If there's a BMS alert, that's why. And it's never gonna turn on until that BMS alert is resolved. And what will happen is the 12 volt battery, no matter what 12 volt battery you put in it, will die. Like, it is going to kill that battery because it is just draining the battery and it's never going to replenish it until the high voltage alert is fixed. That is a very important thing to understand about those BMS alerts, and that you get that resolved and you figure those out. A lot of times with those BMS alerts, you can ask us if you want. You can reach out to support with the BMS alert message and say, hey, you guys maybe know what this one means, or have you seen this one before? And a lot of times we have, and we can throw you back some ideas or thoughts that we might have if we've seen that alert before. All right, that should help with diagnosing your car. The BMS, or Battery Management System, is a microcontroller device inside of our lithium batteries, which monitors the voltage of all the battery cells and all of the current that flows in or out of the battery, and the temperature. It uses that information to make assessments on the safety parameters surrounding the battery, and it's through the use of a MOSFET circuit, it's able to actually disconnect the battery internally if it senses an issue. Those things that it could sense would be the amperage getting way too high during charging or discharging. And what you would see then in the app is the overcurrent charge or the overcurrent discharge alert are triggered, and the corresponding charge or discharge would be turned off inside of the app. To clear those, you would just let it rest outside, or disconnect it from the load, disconnect it from the charger, and allow it to reset back to 0 amps going in or out, and then it will reset. If it doesn't come back online right away, you can use the app to actually re-engage the charge or the discharge once you know that the condition that caused it is gone or done. On the next piece would be voltage. The voltage could get too high, or the voltage could get too low. If the voltage gets too high, then the BMS is able to stop the charging of that battery to prevent it from getting any higher. If the voltage gets too low, same thing, but now it would stop discharging to prevent it from getting any lower. Disconnect from the load. If it's discharging, disconnect it from the load, allow it to rest, and it could turn discharging back on, but really if it's been all the way down, it needs to be charged first before discharging should really be done. So you would then recharge that battery as well. On the top side, if it's getting too high in charging, you would just disconnect the charging and allow it to come back down naturally, and then that alert will go away. And then don't keep charging it, allow it to start discharging before charging commences again. The last possibilities are temperature related. So if the temperature is too high during charging, or the temperature is too high during discharging, it can limit those. And then on the other side, if the temperature is too low during charging, or the temperature is too low during discharging, of course, it could limit those. Same thing, the BMS is looking for a correction of the condition. So looking for the temperature to come back up before it allows discharging to happen, temperature to come back down before it allows charging to happen, whatever the trigger was, it's waiting for the temperature to get back into within normal range. It's pretty uncommon that you will see any of these, especially if installed in a vehicle, because none of the natural normal places that we use the vehicles would subject the 12-volt battery to the temperatures that would fall outside of its operating limits. And of course, none of the normal natural ways that the car uses the battery should ever push it above or below its voltage limits or above its current limits for charging or discharging. So these aren't common alerts that you should ever see, but if you do see them, this is what they mean. And also, of course, if you're using this in a custom application, there's more relevance to all of those things, because they could become common occurrences. That is how the BMS manages everything in terms of safety. The Ohmmu sodium batteries do feature a BMS, but it is a very non-intrusive BMS in that all it does is monitor voltage and balance the voltage between the cells. It doesn't do any controls, whereas as far as turning off or on discharging, charging, and it doesn't monitor the temperature or the current, only the voltage. It also does not have the ability to connect through Bluetooth on our sodium BMS, whereas all of our lithium BMS, our latest models, all include the ability to connect through Bluetooth through the Ohmmu Energy app.